Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. The night the church burned, an Appalachian town disappeared. A heavy autumn fog rolled off the mountain ridge and completely swallowed the isolated valley on the second night of November 1974. Local dispatch logs later showed that every single phone line in the township went completely silent at precisely midnight. State records from that weekend indicated that neighboring communities reported seeing a strange orange glow reflecting against the low clouds. Investigators later discovered that an entire community of nearly 300 residents vanished without leaving a single footprint. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for the sudden and total disappearance of the rural settlement. Harlan Vance was a 42-year-old land surveyor who spent his days charting the rugged terrain of Western Virginia. He had lived in the small hollow of Blackwood his entire life and knew every winding creek by heart. On that particular crisp morning, his only goal was to finish mapping a steep timber tract near the northern ridge. He packed his heavy brass transit and a worn leather-filled notebook into the bed of his old pickup truck. The morning air smelled strongly of damp earth and decaying oak leaves as he started his drive up the mountain. He expected a routine day of clearing brush and shooting straight lines through the dense thicket of pine trees. By 3 in the afternoon, a strange and unnatural darkness began to settle over the deep valleys below his high vantage point. Harlan noticed his compass needle spinning erratically, which was highly unusual for a region without known iron ore deposits. He packed his gear early and decided to head back down the mountain before the visibility became dangerously poor. As he rounded the final bend above the town, he saw a thick column of black smoke rising into the sky. The old White Pine Methodist Church on the hill was completely engulfed in massive orange flames that defied the damp air. He accelerated down the gravel road to see if anyone needed assistance with the sudden and violent blaze. Harlan parked his truck near the edge of the town square and ran toward the burning structure to find help. The heat from the roaring fire was intense, but the surrounding streets were completely empty of any human activity. He shouted for the volunteer fire brigade, but his voice was swallowed by the loud crackle of the dry timber. Not a single person emerged from the nearby houses, and no fire trucks arrived to extinguish the growing blaze. He noticed that every single front door on the main street stood wide open to the cold autumn wind. The eerie silence of the town felt far more unsettling than the roaring fire on the hill above. County files from 1974 later revealed that no distress calls were ever placed from Blackwood during that entire evening. Harlan walked into the general store and found a half-eaten meal sitting on the counter next to the register. A citizen band radio in the back room was emitting nothing but a steady stream of loud, rhythmic static. He discovered several abandoned vehicles parked along the gravel road, all with their keys still hanging inside the ignitions. The entire town felt like a stage where the actors had suddenly vanished in the middle of a live performance. He drove to the nearest working telephone 15 miles away to alert the state police department. He spent the next 3 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to process the eerie and silent scene. Harlan used his detailed surveyor maps to help the search teams systematically check every single homestead in the valley. They found no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains, and absolutely no footprints leading into the surrounding wilderness. Witness statements from neighboring valleys indicated that no traffic had passed through the main highway checkpoints that night. A state police investigator named Silas Thorne found a bizarre detail inside the soot-covered ruins of the church basement. Some locals claimed that the congregation had been acting strangely for several weeks before the fire. Silas discovered a heavy iron hatch hidden beneath the charred floorboards that led into an old limestone cavern system. Harlan helped the investigator lower a lantern into the darkness to inspect the damp stone floor of the cave. They found dozens of fresh boot prints that matched the standard work shoes worn by the local coal miners. The tracks led deep into the subterranean passages that wound directly underneath the entire layout of the vanished town. Mining archives showed these caverns had been privately purchased by a northern coal conglomerate back in 1962. Investigators never confirmed whether the company had authorized any recent blasting operations beneath the residential zone. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather logbook from a small wooden desk situated near the cavern entrance. Archive notes from the local church pastor indicated that the townspeople had been quietly moving their belongings underground for weeks. The final entry described a massive underground coal vein fire that had been burning undetected directly beneath their floorboards. The pastor wrote that the toxic gas levels had finally reached the surface and made immediate evacuation completely mandatory. They planned to burn the old church as a signal to seal the main shafts from the inside forever. Records conflict regarding whether anyone actually survived the treacherous journey through the unmapped subterranean passages. The state authorities ultimately classified the incident as a sudden environmental relocation and permanently restricted access to the valley. Harlan stood on the ridge weeks later and watched workers pour thick concrete into the mouth of the cavern. The empty houses of Blackwood remained standing as silent monuments to a community that chose to vanish into the earth. Investigators closed the case file, but the true fate of the residents remains a subject of intense local debate. The blackened foundation of the church is the only remaining physical reminder of the night a whole town disappeared. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the ninth night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that 3 separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent 2 troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance. When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archive notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. In this news story, they went into Appalachia during winter and never came back. The Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia are known for their dense forests and unpredictable weather patterns during the month of January. In 2014, 3 experienced hikers decided to trek into the Monongahela National Forest to document the rare winter wildlife. They were reportedly well prepared for the freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall that typically define this region during the winter months. However, local dispatch logs indicate that the group failed to check in at their designated base camp 3 days later. A massive search operation was initiated by state records to locate the missing individuals before the next blizzard arrived. The cold air settled over the mountain peaks as investigators began their difficult journey into the wilderness to find any sign. 27-year-old Mark Stevens was a professional surveyor who spent most of his adult life working in remote locations. He was accompanied by Sarah Miller, a 30-year-old biologist, and her younger brother David, who worked as a photographer. Their primary goal was to reach a specific high-altitude ridge to capture images of the forest under heavy ice. County files from 2014 state that Mark was the primary navigator for the group during this specific expedition. They parked their vehicle at the edge of the forest and began their hike while the sun was still high. Witnesses at a nearby gas station claimed the group appeared confident and focused on their objective for the weekend trip. The first night in the forest was reportedly marked by a sudden drop in temperature that exceeded the initial weather forecasts. Archived notes from the rescue team suggest that the hikers may have struggled to maintain a fire during the night. Investigators found an abandoned campsite located near a steep ravine that showed signs of a very hurried and disorganized departure. Some locals claimed that the terrain in that specific area is prone to sudden shifts in visibility due to thick fog. State records indicate that no distress signals were ever received by the local authorities during the first 48 hours. The lack of communication led many to believe that their equipment might have suffered from a catastrophic failure or battery drainage. Search teams discovered a series of footprints leading away from the primary trail and toward a densely wooded section of the slope. These tracks were partially obscured by fresh snow, which made it difficult for the investigators to determine the exact direction. Dispatch logs from the third day of the search mention a single glove found caught on a low-hanging branch. This item was later confirmed by family members to belong to David, who was known for being very meticulous. Investigators never confirmed if the group was being followed by wildlife or if they had simply become disoriented in the dark. The tracks eventually disappeared entirely at the edge of a frozen stream that ran through the center of the valley. Records conflict regarding the exact location where the last known transmission from Mark's mobile device was pinged by the local tower. One state record suggests the signal came from the ridge, while another county file places it much further down the mountain. This inconsistency hampered the rescue efforts and forced the teams to split their resources across a much larger search area. Reported sightings of lights in the woods were investigated, but these claims were eventually dismissed as reflections from the search team. The atmosphere among the rescuers grew increasingly grim as the temperatures dropped to record lows during the fourth night of searching. Everyone understood that survival in these specific conditions without proper shelter was statistically unlikely for any human being trapped outside. The investigation eventually uncovered a set of archived notes from a previous expedition that had encountered similar difficulties in that same region. These notes described a strange geographical anomaly that often interfered with magnetic compasses and modern electronic navigation equipment during the winter. Some locals claimed that the mountains themselves seemed to shift when the snow was thick enough to hide the main landmarks. Investigators never confirmed these theories, but they did note that the hikers had deviated significantly from their planned path. The physical evidence suggests that the group was walking in circles for several hours before they finally stopped near the ravine. It remains unclear why they chose to leave the safety of their primary campsite in the middle of a storm. A final report issued in 2015 stated that the remains of the hikers were never located despite multiple follow-up searches. The case was officially moved to an inactive status after several months of intensive investigation by state and federal authorities. County files from 2015 contain various testimonies from local residents who believe the mountains simply claimed the three hikers. State records focus strictly on the environmental factors such as the extreme cold and the lack of visibility during the blizzard. There are no official claims of anything beyond natural causes for the disappearance of Mark, Sarah, and David Miller that year. The case remains one of the most significant mysteries in the history of the Monongahela National Forest to this day. The Monongahela National Forest covers nearly 1 million acres of land that remains largely untouched by modern civilization and human development. State records from 2014 describe the area as one of the most rugged and challenging environments in the eastern United States. Hikers are frequently warned about the dangers of the high-altitude ridges and the sudden onset of blinding whiteout conditions. Dispatch logs indicate that the search team had to navigate through several feet of fresh snow during the first week. Every investigator assigned to the case noted that the silence in the forest was heavy and almost physically oppressive during the night. The lack of animal tracks in the vicinity of the camp was another detail that the team found very unusual. Investigators spent several weeks reviewing the personal journals and digital logs that Mark Stevens had left behind in his locked vehicle. These archive notes revealed that he had expressed some minor concerns about the accuracy of his GPS unit before they left. He mentioned that the device was displaying strange readings that did not align with the physical maps he had studied earlier. Sarah Miller also wrote a brief note about the unusual behavior of the local birds as they approached the high ridge. She reportedly observed that the wildlife seemed to be moving away from the area even before the storm had actually arrived. These observations were included in the final county file, but were never linked to any specific cause for their disappearance. The search dogs used by the state police reportedly behaved in a very erratic manner when they reached the frozen stream. One handler mentioned in the dispatch logs that his canine refused to cross the water and began to howl at the trees. The other dogs simply sat down and would not follow the scent any further into the dense thicket across the bank. Investigators never confirmed the presence of any large predators like mountain lions or black bears in that specific sector of forest. Some locals claimed that the area near the stream was avoided by experienced hunters due to the frequent loss of direction. The state records do not provide any scientific explanation for why the dogs suddenly lost the trail at that spot. Thermal imaging cameras were deployed by a helicopter crew during the fifth night of the search to look for heat signatures. The records indicate that several small heat sources were detected near the base of a large rock formation in the valley. However, when the ground teams reached the coordinates, they found nothing but the empty frozen ground and some scattered pine branches. The archived notes suggest that these readings might have been false positives caused by the cooling of the mountain rocks themselves. Dispatch logs from that night record a sense of frustration among the pilots who were flying in very dangerous wind conditions. No further heat signatures were detected during the remainder of the aerial search phase of the operation in 2014. County files from 2016 include a testimony from a local park ranger who claimed to have seen something strange. He reported seeing 3 figures standing on a distant ridge during a routine patrol several months after the case was closed. When he looked through his binoculars, the figures had disappeared and there were no tracks left behind in the thin snow. State records dismiss this sighting as a visual illusion caused by the distance and the shifting light of the late afternoon. Investigators never reopened the case based on this single report because there was no physical evidence to support the claim. The ranger later resigned from his position and moved away from the region according to the official personnel records. The equipment found at the abandoned campsite was analyzed by a team of experts to determine if it had been damaged. The state records show that the tent had been sliced open from the inside with a sharp blade or a knife. This specific detail suggested that the hikers were in a state of extreme panic when they decided to flee their shelter. Investigators never confirmed what could have caused such a reaction in 3 people who were so experienced in the wild. Some locals claimed that the sound of the wind in the ravine can mimic the sound of a human voice. Archived notes from the original search team state that the wind was indeed howling at a very high frequency that night. A private investigator hired by the family in 2017 discovered a small digital camera buried in the dirt near the stream. The county file states that the memory card was severely damaged by moisture and the extreme cold of the mountain. Only one image was recovered from the device, and it showed a very blurry view of the forest floor at night. There were no recognizable figures or landmarks in the photograph that could help pinpoint the exact location of the group. Investigators never confirmed if the camera had been dropped or if it had been placed there deliberately by someone else. This piece of evidence was eventually returned to the family after the state police finished their secondary forensic review. The disappearance of the 3 hikers continues to be a topic of discussion among the residents of the small mountain towns. Some locals claim that the forest has a way of hiding things that do not want to be found by anyone. State records remain focused on the facts of the case, which point toward a tragic accident caused by the weather. There is no mention of any suspicious activity or foul play in the final summary provided by the local authorities. Dispatch logs are still occasionally reviewed by new investigators who hope to find a detail that was missed in 2014. The Monongahela National Forest remains as silent and mysterious as it was the day the hikers first walked into the woods. In this new story, true creepy road trip horror stories that happened on cold February nights. The winter weather in the northern United States often creates a sense of isolation that affects the psychological state of many lone travelers. Road trips during the month of February are reportedly documented by state records as being the most dangerous due to unpredictable ice and wind. Most drivers who find themselves stranded on desolate highways claim that the silence of the frozen landscape is more unsettling than the cold itself. These individuals often report seeing figures or vehicles that do not appear in any official law enforcement logs or local county registry files. The following accounts are compiled from archived notes and dispatch logs that detail several strange encounters on the American road during the winter freeze. The empty stretch of Highway 50 near Ely, Nevada, reportedly remains one of the most desolate corridors in the lower 48 states. In 1994, a 22-year-old graduate student named Marcus was driving his sedan toward a research site in the desert. He was a biological researcher tasked with collecting soil samples during the late winter freeze for a university-funded environmental study in 1994. Marcus intended to reach the town of Austin before the temperature dropped below zero that night, but his vehicle began to lose power. The silence of the Great Basin during February is documented in state records as being particularly oppressive to lone travelers in the region. Marcus guided his slowing car onto the narrow gravel shoulder while the surrounding darkness swallowed the remaining light of his dim yellow headlights is less than has-hone. Zero hash is greater than. Investigators never confirmed the exact nature of the mechanical failure that left the sedan immobilized against the frozen sagebrush and the deep snow. Marcus checked his dispatch logs and realized he was outside the range of the nearest transmission tower, which was located several miles away. Some locals claimed that the wind in that region creates auditory illusions that sound like human voices calling from the darkness of the trees. He reportedly sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes while the interior heat of the car escaped through the thin glass windows. The archived notes from the county sheriff department mention a single set of footprints that appeared to circle the vehicle several times. Marcus reportedly felt the car rock gently as if someone were testing the weight of the rear bumper in the freezing midnight air. County files from 1994 indicate that a second vehicle was spotted by a local rancher moving slowly without any lights on. The rancher was a 60-year-old man named Elias who was out checking his livestock near the perimeter fence of his pasture. He told authorities that a dark truck was idling in the middle of the pavement nearly 50 yards behind the stranded sedan of Marcus. Elias noted that the driver of the truck did not exit the vehicle or offer any assistance to the young man stuck in the snow. State records conflict regarding whether this truck was ever registered to anyone living within a 100-mile radius of the Ely region. The rancher stayed in his own vehicle and watched as the mysterious truck slowly turned its wheels toward the shoulder where Marcus sat is less than his own. Zero hash is greater than. Marcus reportedly noticed the shape of the larger vehicle in his rearview mirror and assumed it was a highway patrol officer arriving to help. He stepped out into the bitter cold of the February night and felt the wind chill bite through his heavy winter coat and gloves. The young researcher waved his arms to signal his position, but the approaching truck did not flash its lights or sound its horn. Investigators later found archived notes suggesting that the truck accelerated suddenly once Marcus was standing vulnerable on the open road in the darkness. He allegedly dove back into his sedan and locked the doors while the larger vehicle brushed against the side of his car door. The impact left a long streak of dark paint that remained unidentified during the subsequent investigation by the local county file agents. Records from the dispatch logs show that a frantic emergency call was placed from a nearby ranch house approximately 40 minutes after the encounter. Marcus had reportedly fled his vehicle on foot through the knee-deep snow to reach the lights of the Elias Ranch across the valley. He arrived with severe frostbite on his fingers and claimed that the dark truck had followed him at a walking pace for 2 miles. Some locals claimed that the truck belonged to a transient worker who had been seen in the area during the winter of 1992. However, the investigators never confirmed the identity of the driver or the location of the truck after it turned off the main road. The cold February air allegedly kept the tracks of the mysterious vehicle preserved in the ice for several weeks after the incident is less than has hone. Zero hash is greater than. A similar event was documented in 2011 near the town of Speculator in the Adirondack Mountains of New York during a heavy storm. A 35-year-old nurse named Sarah was traveling home from a double shift at a regional hospital located in the northern woods. Her goal was to reach her cabin before the freezing rain turned the winding mountain passes into sheets of black ice and stone. Sarah reportedly saw a figure standing in the center of the road wearing a bright yellow raincoat that seemed out of place. State records from 2011 describe multiple reports of a hitchhiker matching this description appearing on various nights throughout that specific February. She slowed her vehicle to avoid a collision, but the figure did not move or acknowledge the presence of her heavy SUV. The nurse later told investigators that the person in the yellow coat had no visible face behind the shadow of the hood and rain. She reportedly drove around the figure and watched in her mirror as the person began to run with incredible speed behind her car. Archived notes from the state police mention that Sarah reached speeds of 60 miles per hour on the ice to escape the individual. The records conflict on how a person on foot could maintain such a pace on a surface that was nearly impossible to walk. Some locals claimed the figure was a known prankster from the nearby village, but no one ever stepped forward to claim the responsibility. Sarah reportedly reached her cabin and stayed inside with a loaded shotgun until the sun rose over the frozen peaks the next day, is less than Hassan. Zero hash is greater than. In 2003, a long-haul trucker named Robert was navigating the icy passes of the Cascade Mountains in the state of Washington. He was a 48-year-old driver with 20 years of experience transporting heavy machinery across the northern border of the United States. Robert was behind schedule due to a massive snowstorm that had closed several primary routes through the mountain range during early February. He was forced to take a secondary logging road that was rarely plowed by the state road crews during the peak of winter. The dispatch logs from his trucking company indicate that he checked in at 11 o'clock at night to report heavy fog conditions. Robert reportedly saw a pair of headlights appearing in his side mirror that seemed to be maintaining a very consistent distance behind him. The truck driver noticed that the following vehicle was not using its high beams despite the total lack of visibility on the narrow road. He slowed down to let the other driver pass, but the vehicle behind him also decreased its speed to match his own pace. Robert reportedly used his radio to contact any other drivers in the area, but he received only static and distant white noise. Archived notes from the State Patrol show that no other commercial vehicles were authorized to be on that specific road that evening. He grew concerned when the following vehicle began to weave back and forth across the center line of the snowy logging path. The county file from 2003 contains a statement from Robert describing the vehicle as a vintage black limousine from the 50s is less than Hashown. Zero hash is greater than. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a vintage limousine in the region because there were no registration records for such a car in Washington. Robert reportedly saw the driver of the limousine pull alongside his massive truck while they were navigating a sharp turn over a steep cliff. He claimed that the interior of the car was filled with a thick green light that obscured the features of the person driving. The truck driver forced his vehicle into a higher gear and managed to pull away from the mysterious car on a straight stretch. Some locals claimed that an old hotel at the top of the pass used to operate a fleet of similar cars in 1950. Robert reached the main highway and found that the black car had vanished into the swirling snow without leaving any tire tracks. Another account from 1988 involves a young couple named David and Linda who were driving through the rural hills of Kentucky. They were both 24-year-old teachers who were traveling to visit family for a winter wedding during the first week of February. David was driving their small hatchback while Linda consulted a paper map because they had become lost on the back roads near Owsley. The state records from 1988 indicate that a series of strange sightings occurred in that county during the same winter month. They reportedly encountered a roadblock consisting of several large wooden crates that had been placed across the width of the narrow pavement. David stopped the car and remained inside while he waited for someone to appear and explain the obstruction in the freezing road is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. Linda reportedly saw several figures moving through the thick brush on the side of the road while they sat in their idling car. The figures were described in archive notes as being extremely tall and wearing dark clothing that blended into the shadows of the trees. David decided to put the car in reverse and turn around rather than getting out to move the heavy wooden crates himself. He told investigators that the figures began to throw large rocks at the vehicle, which shattered the rear window of the hatchback. They fled the area at high speed and reported the incident to the local sheriff office once they reached a gas station. Some locals claimed that a group of survivalists had been living in the woods and did not want any outsiders on the road. The county file from 1988 shows that deputies went to the location but found no crates and no footprints in the snow. Investigators never confirmed who had placed the obstacles or why the figures had attacked the couple during their quiet road trip in February. David and Linda refused to travel through that part of Kentucky again, and their story was eventually filed away in the cold cases. Records conflict regarding whether the rocks found in the car were local limestone or something that had been brought from a different region. The couple reportedly suffered from night terrors for several years following the event, but they never found any logical explanation for the encounter. Most state records from that era remain sealed or have been lost due to a fire in the county archives building. A final report from 2015 describes a lone traveler named Thomas who was driving through the plains of North Dakota in winter. Thomas was a 50-year-old insurance adjuster who was traveling between remote farms to inspect damage from a recent blizzard in February. He reportedly found himself on a stretch of road where the snow had drifted so high that it formed white walls on either side. Dispatch logs indicate that he called his office to say that he was seeing a house in the middle of the road. Thomas claimed that the house was fully lit and looked like it belonged in a suburban neighborhood rather than a snowy field. Archive notes suggest that he stopped his car and watched as the front door of the house slowly opened in the wind. Thomas reportedly saw a woman standing in the doorway who was wearing a summer dress and holding a glass of iced tea in her hand. He stayed in his car because the temperature outside was 10 degrees below zero, and the scene did not make any logical sense. The woman waved at him and began to walk toward his vehicle across the deep snow without wearing any shoes or a coat. Investigators never confirmed the existence of a house in that location, as the land was part of a protected wildlife refuge area. Thomas drove his car into the snowbank to get around the woman and did not look back until he reached town. Some locals claimed that heat exhaustion or extreme cold can cause vivid hallucinations that look exactly like the memories of home. The state records from 2015 show that Thomas was found 3 hours later sitting in his car at a local diner. He was in a state of shock and his vehicle had no signs of damage despite his claim of driving through a snowbank. The archive notes from the hospital mentioned that his body temperature was normal and there were no signs of drugs or alcohol. Investigators checked the road where he had been driving, but they found only an empty field covered in a smooth layer of ice. Records conflict on whether Thomas ever returned to his job as an insurance adjuster after the strange encounter in the North Dakota plains. Many people believe that the February cold creates a thin spot in reality where the past and present begin to overlap. In this new story, quiet California urban legends that people still whisper about at night. In 2022, state records from a coastal county in California detailed a series of strange occurrences involving hikers. Local authorities reportedly investigated multiple claims of unidentified figures moving through the dense fog during the early morning hours near Big Sur. These archived notes suggest that several individuals vanished without a trace while walking along the well-marked trails of the region. Investigators never confirmed any foul play, yet some locals claim that certain sections of the forest should remain completely avoided. The official dispatch logs indicate that search parties found only abandoned equipment left behind by the missing people during late autumn. Mark was a 34-year-old park ranger who worked specifically within the rugged terrain of the Central Coast. His daily job required him to monitor wildlife patterns and maintain the safety of the various trails used by seasonal tourists. He arrived at the remote observation station with the goal of documenting local coyote populations for a state-funded study. Records conflict regarding his exact location during the final hours of his shift before he failed to check in officially. The county file from 2009 mentions that no distress signal was ever received from his standard issue radio equipment. Mark reportedly left his official vehicle parked at the trailhead with the engine still running and the driver door open. The search team discovered a set of footprints that appeared to lead directly into a solid wall of thick brush. Archive notes from the investigation describe how the tracks stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. State records indicate that the soil around the tracks showed no signs of a struggle or any other human presence. Investigators never confirmed if the footprints belonged to Mark or if another person had been walking in that specific area. The county file from 2009 remains one of the most puzzling cases for the local sheriff department to solve. Some locals claimed that they heard a metallic tapping sound coming from the canyon for several nights after he disappeared. Sarah was a 28-year-old freelance photographer who traveled to the area to capture the unique natural light. She spent most of her time near the cliff edges where the Pacific Ocean meets the rocky shoreline of Northern California. Her purpose for being in the location was to complete a series of images for a prestigious travel magazine project. Sarah reportedly told her friends that she felt a strange sensation of being watched while she was taking her photographs. State records show that her last social media post was a photo of the ocean taken at 4 in the afternoon. The image appears to show a dark shape standing just behind a cluster of trees on the edge of the cliff. Dispatch logs reveal that several residents called the police to report a woman screaming near the beach that same evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the screams, and they found no evidence of any person being in distress there. Archive notes describe how her car was found, with the keys still in the ignition and her wallet on the seat. Some locals claimed that the coastal fog can play tricks on the ears and make the wind sound like human voices. State records from 2023 indicate that a commercial diver found a small piece of blue fabric near the rocks. This fabric reportedly matched the color of the jacket Sarah was wearing on the day that she was last seen alive. The small-town residents often speak about a third individual named David, who was a 40-year-old local historian. David spent many years collecting old maps of the Sierra Nevada mountains to find the location of the lost village. The county file from 2009 includes a map that he had hand-drawn with several red circles on it. State records show that he purchased a large amount of survival gear just 2 days before he left for his trip. Some locals claimed that David believed the lost village was protected by people who did not want to be found. Investigators never confirmed if he reached his destination, but they found his empty tent near a remote mountain stream. Archive notes mention that the tent was torn from the inside, as if something was trying to get out quickly. A local rancher reportedly told the sheriff that he saw a group of men dressed in dark clothing near the stream. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that the rancher was considered a reliable witness by the local authorities at the time. State records show that the men were never identified and they seem to have no connection to the nearby towns. Records conflict regarding whether the men were carrying tools or if they were simply walking through the dense forest area. Investigators never confirmed if these men were related to the disappearance of David or the other missing hikers in California. The county file from 2009 mentions that several other historians had disappeared in the same region over decades. Some locals claimed that there are secret tunnels under the mountains that date back to the time of the gold rush. State records indicate that no such tunnels have ever been officially discovered by geologists or by any modern survey teams. Archived notes from 2012 describe a series of low-frequency vibrations that were recorded by seismic sensors in the area. Investigators never confirmed the cause of these vibrations, but they noted that the local wildlife became very agitated and loud. Records conflict on whether these events are linked to the urban legends that continue to haunt the rural coastal towns. Another report in the dispatch logs from 2019 describes a driver who claimed to see a transparent figure on Highway 1. The driver was a 50-year-old long-haul trucker who had been working the California routes for 20 years. He reportedly saw a person standing in the middle of the road during a heavy rainstorm near the Big Sur Bridge. State records show that he slammed on his brakes, but there was no impact and no body was ever found. Investigators never confirmed if the trucker was suffering from fatigue or if he truly saw something on the lonely road. Archived notes from the Highway Patrol mention that 3 other drivers reported the same figure during that specific weekend. Some locals claimed that the figure is a woman who vanished from a nearby resort during the summer of 1990. Records conflict regarding her name, but the county file from 2009 contains a missing person report from that era. State records indicate that she was a 42-year-old tourist from Oregon who was visiting the coast alone. Dispatch logs from 1990 show that her hotel room was left exactly as if she intended to return shortly. Investigators never confirmed any leads in her case, and the file was eventually moved to the Cold Case Department for review. The archive notes mention that her footprints were found leading away from the resort and into the deep ocean water. In 2021, a group of researchers found a set of old keys buried in the sand near the cliffs. The county file from 2009 lists these keys as a possible match for a car owned by David. State records show that the keys were heavily corroded, but they still functioned when they were tested on a similar lock. Some locals claimed that finding the keys was a sign that the missing people are still present in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory, and the keys were placed into an evidence locker for further study by forensic teams. Archived notes from the lab report indicate that there was no usable DNA found on the surface of the metal. Dispatch logs from the winter of 2024 mention a series of strange phone calls to the local police station. The callers reportedly heard nothing but heavy breathing and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the line. State records show that these calls were traced back to a phone booth that had been disconnected for 15 years. Investigators never confirmed how a disconnected phone could make outgoing calls to the emergency dispatch center during the middle of the night. Records conflict on whether this was a technical glitch in the aging phone system or a series of deliberate pranks. Some locals claimed that the calls always happen on the anniversary of the major disappearances in the coastal region. Archive notes from a retired sheriff detail his personal belief that the geography of California hides many secrets from the public. He reportedly spent his retirement years cataloging the various urban legends and mapping them against the official state records of incidents. The county file from 2009 contains a letter he wrote to the governor regarding the high number of cases. State records show that the governor never responded to the letter, and the sheriff passed away in 2021. Investigators never confirmed if his research had any merit or if he was simply an old man with too much time. Some locals claimed that his private journals were taken by men in dark suits after his funeral ended. Records conflict regarding the contents of those journals, but some believe they contained the truth about the missing people of California. Archive notes from a local librarian suggest that the sheriff had found a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. State records show that most of the events occur during the transition between the spring and the summer seasons each year. Dispatch logs from 2025 indicate that 2 more hikers have gone missing near the same coastal trail system. Investigators never confirmed if these new cases are related to the historical legends that have been told for many years. Some locals claimed that the forest is slowly expanding and reclaiming the land that was once occupied by the settlers. The county file from 2009 remains a primary source of information for those who seek to understand these events. State records will continue to document the facts, while the urban legends will continue to grow in the quiet coastal towns. Archived notes from the investigation suggest that the truth may never be fully known by the authorities or the public. Investigators never confirmed any supernatural activity, but the data they collected remains difficult to explain using only modern scientific methods. Records conflict on the final count of people who have vanished into the fog of the Northern California coastline. Some locals claimed that if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the voices of the missing. In this new story, true scary February snowstorm horror stories that still haunt survivors. In February 2012, 28-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne navigated the dense tree line of the Cascade Mountains alone. He was stationed at a remote outpost to monitor snowpack levels before a predicted record-breaking atmospheric river event occurred. Elias was an experienced outdoorsman who understood the physical risks of isolation during severe Pacific Northwest winter weather patterns daily. State records indicate that the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours as the massive storm front arrived. The sudden shift in pressure reportedly caused several electronic instruments inside the ranger station to malfunction without any logical warning. Investigators never confirmed why the emergency radio remained silent during the most critical hours of the initial freezing whiteout event. The wind outside reached 80 miles per hour, which stripped the thick bark from the ancient pine trees surrounding the cabin. Elias noted in his logs that the sound resembled human screaming, but he attributed this to the gale force wind. According to archive notes found later, he spent the evening reinforcing the heavy wooden shutters against the mounting heavy snow. Some locals claimed that this specific region was prone to strange acoustic anomalies during high-altitude pressure drops in winter. Records conflict regarding whether Elias was alone or if a secondary traveler had sought shelter at the station gate area. The county file from 2012 describes a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds against the reinforced front door that night. When the primary generator failed, Elias had to rely on a small kerosene lamp to maintain visibility inside the freezing room. He reportedly saw a figure standing motionless in the middle of the clearing through a small gap in the shutters. Dispatch logs show that no other rangers were within 50 miles of his location due to the extreme road conditions. The figure did not move for 4 hours despite the sub-zero temperatures and the blinding horizontal sheets of falling ice. Elias wrote that the person seemed to be wearing a summer uniform, which was logically impossible given the environment conditions. State records show that no missing persons reports were filed for that specific area during the month of February snows. By the morning of the second day, the snow had completely buried the first floor of the small mountain outpost building. Elias attempted to dig a tunnel toward the equipment shed, but he found the snow was packed with unnatural density. He discovered a set of barefoot prints leading away from his door into the center of the frozen forest floor. Investigators never confirmed how a human could survive those conditions without thermal gear or even basic leather winter boots today. The archived notes mentioned that Elias found his own name carved into the ice on the inside of the glass. There is no official explanation for how the frost formed into specific English characters during the peak of the storm. Elias spent the next 6 hours monitoring the barometer, which continued to drop into ranges rarely seen in Washington state history. He reportedly heard a series of voices whispering from the ventilation shafts despite being alone in a soundproof metal bunker. County files from 2012 indicate that the ranger station was designed to withstand much higher wind loads than recorded. Investigators never confirmed if the structural groaning was the result of the storm or something moving across the roof. Elias wrote in his final log entry that the shadow outside had moved closer to the thick, reinforced window pane. Some locals claimed that the pressure caused hallucinations, but the physical marks on the glass suggested a more solid presence. The search and rescue teams arrived 3 days later once the atmospheric river had finally moved toward the Idaho border. They found the station completely encased in a layer of black ice that required heavy industrial tools to break through. Dispatch logs show that the interior of the station was perfectly preserved, but Elias was nowhere to be found today. There were no signs of a struggle, and his cold weather gear was still hanging neatly by the kitchen stove. The county file from 2012 mentions that a single set of wet footprints led into the basement area alone. Records conflict on whether the basement door was locked from the inside or the outside when the team arrived. In February 2015, 24-year-old Sarah Miller was driving through the Oregon wilderness during a massive blizzard. She was a freelance journalist traveling to a small town to document the effects of the prolonged drought on locals. According to state records, Sarah was reported missing by her editor after she failed to check in from her hotel. Dispatch logs indicate that her vehicle was found abandoned on a Forest Service road that was not on any map. The car was running, and the heater was set to the highest possible temperature setting despite the empty driver's seat. Investigators never confirmed why she would leave a warm vehicle to walk into a blizzard without a heavy coat. The digital images on the camera showed a series of blurred shapes moving through the trees during the heavy snowfall. Some locals claimed that the shapes resembled tall, thin figures with elongated limbs that did not match any local wildlife. Archived notes from the investigation describe a strange humming sound that was captured on the final video file found later. Records conflict regarding the presence of footprints around the car because the wind had scoured the ground to the dirt. Sarah reportedly left a voicemail for her mother that consisted entirely of rhythmic tapping sounds in a specific sequence pattern. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping was a form of code or simply interference from the collapsing cell towers. A local hunter found a red scarf snagged on a branch near the summit of a peak called the Devil's Backbone. The county file from 2015 confirms that the scarf belonged to Sarah and was stained with strange gray ash. Some locals claimed that the area was a site of frequent magnetic disturbances that caused compasses to spin wildly today. Investigators never confirmed if Sarah had become disoriented by the whiteout conditions or if she was following a path. Archive notes mentioned that the search dogs refused to enter the dense thicket where the scarf was located that afternoon. State records show that the search was called off after 12 days due to another incoming storm system arriving. In February 2019, a group of 3 college students went missing while camping in the remote Appalachian Mountains area. They were 21-year-old Mark, 20-year-old Chloe, and 22-year-old David studying local geology. According to state records, they had obtained a permit to collect rock samples from a specific limestone cave system there. Dispatch logs show that their last communication was a text message sent to a friend at midnight on Friday night. The message reportedly contained only a single word, which was the name of a town that no longer existed today. Investigators never confirmed how the students reached the deep interior of the forest, given the deep snowdrifts present. Inside the tent, investigators found 3 sets of sleeping bags that had been arranged in a perfect triangle formation tonight. Records conflict on whether the students had time to put on their boots before fleeing into the freezing night air. Some locals claimed that the limestone caves acted as a natural amplifier for subsonic frequencies that caused intense panic attacks. Archive notes from the search team state that they heard the sound of children laughing deep within the rock walls. Investigators never confirmed the source of the laughter since there were no families living within 20 miles of the site. State records show that David's glasses were found resting on a ledge 50 feet above the ground level, clearly. By the time the snow melted in April, a hiker discovered a backpack hanging from a high branch near cave. The backpack contained a journal with entries that stopped abruptly on the night the storm began in February 2019. The final page contained a detailed drawing of a face with no eyes or mouth looking through a window glass. Some locals claimed that this image matched old folklore stories from the region about the entities of the frost. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the person who drew the image, since the handwriting was completely illegible today. The county file from 2019 remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of the park. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clench Mountain Range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archived notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claim to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. In this new story, people who went into West Virginia's woods and never came back. Many hikers believe that the deep forests of the Appalachian Range are just quiet places for weekend camping trips today. There are stories in the West Virginia mountains about travelers who walked into the trees and simply vanished forever now. This documented account follows a professional geologist who discovered a remote campsite that should not have existed at all. Gideon Vance was a 46-year-old hydrogeologist who specialized in mapping underground springs in very remote areas. He was known for his calm personality and his ability to survive in the wilderness for several weeks alone. In the spring of 2022, Gideon was hired to survey a valley near the edge of the forest. The local residents warned him about a specific ridge where the compass needles often spun in circles without any reason. Gideon did not believe in local superstitions, and he focused on the scientific data provided by his expensive digital tools. He packed his waterproof gear and hiked deep into a canyon where the cell phone signals were completely non-existent. The equipment in his heavy pack included a laser level and a high-precision digital watch that used satellite signals. He carried enough food for 7 days and a small weatherproof logbook to record his various scientific observations daily. The air in the canyon was heavy and smelled of damp moss and the ancient stone of the rising mountain. On the second morning of his trip, Gideon reached a clearing that was not marked on any of his maps. He found a canvas tent that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, sitting near a cold stone fire. There were no modern items like plastic bottles or synthetic fabrics anywhere near the small and very quiet campsite. He called out to see if anyone was nearby, but the only response was the sound of the wind through. Gideon approached the tent and noticed a cast iron skillet sitting on the rocks with fresh bacon grease inside it. He felt a sudden chill even though the sun was shining brightly over the high ridges of the deep valley. Inside the tent, he found a wooden crate containing supplies and a tattered leather journal with yellowed and fragile pages. The handwriting was neat and described a hiking trip taken by two brothers in the summer of 1954. He noticed that the local wildlife seemed unusually quiet, which was a detail he noted in his small weather logbook. The silence of the forest seemed to press against his ears as he turned the brittle pages of the old book. The final entry was dated June 12th and mentioned a strange humming sound coming from the rocks nearby that morning. Gideon looked at the ground and saw a pair of leather boots that looked brand new despite the vintage style. He picked up a newspaper from the crate and saw the headline was from the year 1954 today. He heard a branch snap behind him and turned to see two men wearing heavy flannel shirts and denim pants. The men looked confused and asked Gideon why he was wearing such strange and brightly colored synthetic hiking clothes today. They explained that they had only been camping for 2 days and were waiting for their father to return soon. Gideon realized with a shock that these men matched the descriptions of two brothers who disappeared 70 years ago today. He checked his watch and noticed that the date on his digital screen was now flickering between different years rapidly. The brothers, whose names were Alistair and Emmett, noticed the laser level on his tripod and backed away in terror. Gideon tried to explain that he was a scientist, but his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He felt a sense of overwhelming vertigo, as if the ground beneath his boots was turning into a gray mist. He ran back toward the main trail and did not look back at the clearing or the two lost brothers. The woods looked different in the fading light, and every tree seemed to shift its position when he turned now. When he reached his truck, he found that the police were already there searching for a missing man named Gideon. The officer named Dalton Grady told him that he had been missing for over 3 weeks in the deep woods. Gideon felt like he had only been away from his vehicle for 2 hours before he reached the main road. He checked his pack and found the leather journal from 1954 sitting right on top of his maps. The final page now had a new entry that described a man in bright orange clothes who visited their camp. Gideon never returned to that part of the West Virginia forest, and he left the geology profession shortly after that. He still dreams about the humming sound in the rocks and the smell of the fresh bacon in the woods. The mountains of West Virginia continue to hold their secrets in the deep places where time does not always move. Some structures are not built of wood and stone, but are woven into the very fabric of the passing years. If you find yourself lost in the woods near the border, you should probably keep moving until the sun comes. The ending of the tale sounds fake until you see the journal and the date written in your own hand. The truth is a shadow that follows you home from the woods and stays with you until the very end. This event remains one of the most puzzling cases in the archives of the local search and rescue teams today. Witness statements from the family members of the missing brothers confirm that the handwriting in the journal is perfectly authentic. The police files include photographs of the campsite that Gideon found, but the clearing was empty when they arrived there. They found no tent and no fire and no signs of the two brothers who had been seen by Gideon. The only evidence left behind was the journal that Gideon had taken from the wooden crate during his initial discovery. Forensic analysis of the paper showed that it was manufactured in the early 1950s, but it showed no aging. The ink was still fresh, and the leather binding had not yet developed the cracks typically found on antique books. Geologists who studied the canyon reported that the rock formations contain unusual magnetic properties that might affect local electronic devices. Some researchers believe that the humming sound Gideon heard was a result of geological pressure deep within the mountain range. Others suggest that the canyon is a place where different eras overlap for a few minutes when the weather changes. Gideon Vance spent several years trying to understand the physics of his experience, but he never found a clear answer. He often visits the county library to look at the missing persons files from the middle of the last century. He found a report about Alistair and Emmett that mentioned they were last seen carrying a heavy canvas camping tent. The photograph in the file showed two young men who were the exact same people Gideon met in the clearing. Their father had also disappeared that same week and was never found by the police or the local search parties. The case remains officially open because the bodies of the brothers were never recovered from the deep and dark woods. Gideon believes that the brothers are still in the canyon waiting for their father to return to their small camp. He often wonders if they saw him as a ghost from the future or a demon from another world entirely. The memory of their confused faces stays with him, and he can still hear their voices in his quiet mind. The forest has grown over the trails that lead to that specific coordinate, and the maps are no longer accurate. The government has restricted access to the valley, citing environmental concerns and the danger of the steep and rocky terrain. Most people who live in the area avoid the mountain and tell their children to stay away from the trees. They know that the woods can take a person and hold them for 70 years without letting them grow old. The silence of the mountain is a warning to those who think they can master the secrets of the wild. If you hear a humming sound in the rocks, you should turn around and run as fast as you. Do not look for the clearing and do not speak to the men who are wearing the flannel shirts today. The past is a dangerous place, and it does not always let you return to the present day in one fort. The ending of the story is the part that stays with you when you are walking alone in the night. The mystery is the heart of the wild, and the heart of the wild is a cold and dark. Gideon Thorne is the only witness to a truth that science cannot explain or even begin to understand fully now. The archived dispatch logs from the night of his return record a man who was terrified of his own watch. The officers who processed the report noted that Gideon appeared to have aged several years in just a few weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, and he spoke in a hurried whisper about a camp that did not exist on maps. They took his statement and filed it away with the other unexplained reports from the Appalachian Mountain range this year. The journal is kept in a safe at the university where researchers occasionally study the strange and fresh ink. No one has been able to reproduce the magnetic conditions that Gideon described in his detailed and very professional notes. The mountain continues to stand over the valley, and the fog still rolls through the trees in the morning. Some say the brothers are still there, and they are still waiting for the sun to go down today. The story of the surveyor is a warning to those who believe that time is a straight and simple line. It is a loop that can catch you and hold you in a moment that never ends or begins. The woods of West Virginia are deep, and they are very old, and they do not like to be. The ending of the story sounds fake until you stand in the fog and hear the sound of the rocks. The truth is in the journal, and the journal is in the safe, and the safe is in the forest is waiting for the next person to lose their way in the mist of the high ridges. The tale is told, and the listener is warned, and the cabin is waiting in the deep and dark. The story of Gideon Vance is a legacy of the unknown in the heart of the great American wild. The ending is the part that stays with you when you turn off the light at the end day. The mystery is the ending, and the ending is the mystery in the quiet woods of the mountain range. The story is finished, and the forest is dark, and the mountains are silent, and the truth is free. The geologist is home, and the camp is gone, and the brothers are waiting for their father to return soon. The ending is the beginning of the next story, in the heart of the great and ancient mountain wild. The tale of the man who saw the past in the present is done for now in the woods are calling, and the fog is rolling, and the mystery is yours to keep for a long. The ending is the silence that follows the final word of the story of the lost and the truth. The truth is a shadow in the trees, and the trees are the only ones who know the secrets. The story is done, and the fire is out, and the dark is all that remains in the fire. The forensic evidence of the journal remains the only physical proof that the brothers were ever seen after 1954. Handwriting experts compared the new entry to the older pages and found they were written by the same person. This would mean that the boy from the past wrote about Gideon in the future with the same pen today. The local sheriff continues to keep the case on his desk because it is the only one he cannot solve. He looks at the vintage boots in the evidence room and wonders how they could stay so clean and new. The valley is a place where the air stays still and the seasons do not follow the normal calendar cycles. Gideon Vance never went back to the mountains, and he never looked at another digital watch for his entire life. He preferred the steady ticking of an old mechanical clock that stayed in the present moment with him at home. The story of the disappearance is told in hushed tones by the residents of the nearby mountain town of Blackwood. They know that the woods are not just trees and rocks, but are a living part of the local Blackwood. The mystery is a gift for those who listen to the whispers of the wild and the hidden places now. The ending of the tale is the part you will remember when you are walking alone in the forest. The story is a circle, and the circle is a map, and the map leads back to the start. The truth is a fire that burns in the heart of the dark and the silence of the mountain. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. In this new story, something followed them while camping. In the deep woods of the Cascade Mountains during July of 2024, a terrifying event reportedly changed 2 lives. Mark was a 28-year-old civil engineer who often looked for peace within the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. He had spent years exploring the various trails of Washington state, and he felt very comfortable in the dense evergreen forests. His partner, Sarah, was a 27-year-old pharmacy technician who wanted to escape the stress of her daily office work. They had planned this specific trip for several months, and they were both excited to spend some time under the stars. The couple arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning while the mist was still clinging to the tall pine trees. They checked their equipment one last time, and then they began the long journey toward a high ridge overlooking a lake. Dispatch logs from the Forest Service show that they had registered their itinerary with the local ranger station before they started. The path was steep and narrow, but they made good time as they climbed higher into the rugged and wild terrain. They reportedly found a suitable campsite near a small stream that provided them with a reliable source of fresh and cold water. Sarah began setting up their small tent, while Mark gathered enough firewood to last them through the duration of the chilly night. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the shadows grew long across the forest floor as they finished their work. They didn't see anyone else on the trail that day, and they believed they were completely alone in the vast wilderness. While they were eating their dinner by the fire, Sarah mentioned that she felt a strange presence looming just beyond the light. Mark scanned the dark perimeter with his high-powered flashlight, but he didn't see anything unusual among the thick trunks of the trees. He told her that it was likely just a deer, or perhaps a small bear foraging for food in the nearby brush. They tried to relax, but the oppressive silence of the forest made them feel increasingly uneasy as the night grew much colder. State records later indicated that the couple went to sleep around 11 o'clock, but their rest was interrupted by a rhythmic tapping. Something was reportedly striking the side of their tent with a light and persistent force that sounded like a thin wooden stick. Mark sat up and listened intently to the sound, but it stopped as soon as he reached for his tactical camping knife. He didn't want to alarm Sarah, so he stayed quiet while he stared at the thin fabric of the tent wall. The next morning, they found several small stones placed in a perfect circle around the cold remains of their campfire from the night. Sarah was certain that those rocks were not there when they had gone to sleep, and she started to feel very afraid. Mark tried to find a logical explanation for the circle, but he couldn't think of any natural process that would do that. They decided to keep their original plan and hike further into the mountains, despite the growing sense of dread that they felt. County files from 2024 note that the couple felt a heavy presence following them as they moved up the trail. Every time they stopped to rest, they would hear the sound of branches breaking in the thick woods about 50 yards behind. Mark looked back several times, but the dense foliage made it impossible to see if a person or an animal was there. They couldn't explain why whatever was following them stayed just out of sight while maintaining such a consistent and frightening pace. As evening approached, they reached a high plateau that offered a wide view of the valley, but they didn't feel any safer. The wind began to pick up, and the temperature dropped rapidly as a thick layer of gray clouds moved over the peaks. They set up their camp in a small clearing, and they made sure to keep their gear very close to the tent. Sarah reportedly saw a tall and thin shadow move behind a large boulder, but it vanished before she could point it out. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the figure, but archived notes suggest that someone might have been living illegally in those woods. During the middle of the second night, the couple was woken up by the sound of heavy breathing just outside their tent. Mark didn't hesitate this time, and he shouted loudly to scare away whatever was standing right next to their sleeping heads. He heard something scramble away into the darkness, but the sounds were bipedal, and they definitely did not belong to a bear. The two hikers didn't wait for morning to arrive before they packed their essential items and started the long descent back down. They left their expensive tent and their heavy sleeping bags behind because they were terrified of staying in that location any longer. Every step they took felt like a race against an unseen predator that was watching them from the safety of the shadows. They reportedly reached their car as the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the highest trees in Washington. A subsequent search by the local authorities found their abandoned gear, but there were no signs of a struggle at the camp. State records show that the case was eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or any identifiable suspects in the region. Records conflict regarding the number of similar reports, but some locals claimed that several other hikers had vanished in that specific area. Mark and Sarah never returned to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and they don't plan on going camping ever again in life. Local county files from 2024 describe the physical state of the abandoned items that the search party recovered near the ridge. The tent had been neatly folded, but the poles were missing and the fabric had several small holes that looked like bite marks. Sarah's digital camera was found resting on a flat rock about 20 yards away from the original site of their base camp. The investigators found no images on the memory card, except for a single blurry photo of a dark shape among the trees. A detailed report from the state records suggests that the hikers were lucky to have escaped the wilderness without any physical injuries. The region where they were camping has a long history of unexplained disappearances that date back to the early 1980s. Dispatch logs show that multiple search and rescue missions have been launched in that specific area over the last several decades. Most of those cases ended without any resolution, and the missing people were never seen by their friends or their families. Mark reportedly struggled with night terrors for several months after the incident, and he often woke up feeling like he was being watched. He told his therapist that he could still hear the sound of the heavy breathing right next to his ear every night. Sarah decided to move to a different city because the sight of the nearby mountains caused her to have severe panic attacks. They tried to find answers by talking to other hikers online, but they only found more stories that were equally disturbing. Records conflict about whether the authorities ever interviewed a suspicious man who was seen wandering near the trailhead that same weekend in July. This individual was reportedly wearing a heavy winter coat despite the warm weather, and he did not have any hiking or camping gear. He disappeared before the sheriff's deputies could arrive at the scene to ask him about his presence in the national forest area. No one knows for sure what was following Mark and Sarah that weekend, but the evidence remains locked in a county file. The trail they followed was known as the High Ridge Loop, which covers over 20 miles of some of the most difficult terrain. Archived notes from the local hiking club mention that several parts of the trail are prone to sudden fog and very low visibility. Mark and Sarah had prepared for these conditions by bringing extra layers of clothing and a reliable GPS device for their navigation needs. They didn't anticipate that the main threat would come from something that was watching them from within the shadows of the trees. When the search party arrived at the campsite, they noticed that the surrounding brush had been cleared in a very deliberate and unnatural way. State records indicate that the branches were snapped at a height of about 7 feet, which is much higher than any local animal. The investigators also found a small pile of rusted metal objects that had been placed carefully near the entrance of the abandoned tent. These items included old tin cans and a broken pocket watch that appeared to be from the early part of the 20th century. County files from 2024 show that the sheriff was deeply concerned about the strange patterns that were discovered at the forest site. There was no sign of a struggle or any blood, but the overall atmosphere of the camp was described as being very malevolent. One deputy reported hearing a faint whistling sound coming from the deep ravine while he was collecting the hikers' belongings for the official report. He didn't find the source of the noise, but he later resigned from his position at the department due to a nervous breakdown. Investigators never confirmed if the strange items found at the camp belonged to a person who had been living in the woods for years. Some locals claimed that an old hermit had been seen near the lake, but no official records exist to prove his actual identity. The case remains open, and it is still discussed by many people who enjoy exploring the mysteries of the Pacific Northwest wilderness region. Mark and Sarah's story serves as a grim reminder that some things in the woods are better left alone and completely undisturbed. The pharmacy where Sarah worked eventually granted her a long leave of absence so she could focus on her mental health and her recovery. She spent many hours in therapy trying to process the events of that weekend, but the fear remained deeply rooted in her mind. Mark also found it difficult to return to his normal life, and he eventually sold all of his camping and hiking equipment online. They don't talk about that trip anymore because the memories are too painful and they only want to move forward with their lives. Dispatch logs from the night of the incident reveal that several other callers had reported seeing strange lights in the sky over the forest. These reports were never linked to the experience of the two hikers, but they add another layer of mystery to the entire situation. Some people believe that the forest itself has a way of manipulating the minds of those who dare to enter its deepest parts. Records conflict on this theory, but the fact remains that Mark and Sarah were changed forever by what they experienced in Washington. The final report from the county coroner's office mentioned that no physical crimes were committed during the duration of the couple's camping trip. However, the psychological impact of being stalked by an unknown entity is often much more damaging than any physical injury could ever be. State records from 2024 are now archived, and they are only available to those who have a very specific legal reason. The truth about what happened on that high ridge in the Cascade Mountains may never be fully known by the public or authorities. A local reporter attempted to investigate the history of the High Ridge Loop, but he found that many of the files were missing. He reportedly spoke to a retired forest ranger who claimed that the government had purchased several large tracts of land in that area. These state records were allegedly sealed for national security reasons, but no one could explain why a forest would need such high protection. The reporter eventually dropped the story after he received several anonymous phone calls warning him to stop his research into the local matter. Mark once told a close friend that he saw a face peering through the mesh of the tent during the second night of camp. He described the features as being very pale and sunken with eyes that seemed to reflect the light of the dying embers outside. Sarah reportedly didn't see the face, but she felt the weight of something heavy pressing against the side of her sleeping bag. They both agreed that the entity was not trying to help them, but was instead waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trail has since been closed to the public due to a series of rock slides that made the path too dangerous for most hikers. Some locals claimed that the rock slides were not a natural event, but were instead caused by someone who wanted to keep people away. Investigators never confirmed these rumors, and the official state records simply cite the weather as the primary cause for the trail closure. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest remains a place of beauty and mystery, but for some, it is a place of absolute terror. The county file from 2024 includes a series of photographs taken of the ground where the tent had been located. These images show a pattern of deep depressions that look like someone had been kneeling in the dirt for a long time. Investigators never confirmed what caused these marks, but they were certainly not made by any equipment that the hikers had brought along. Some locals claimed that this specific spot was known to be avoided by the native tribes who lived in the region. State records show that the case was officially moved to a cold status after 6 months of investigation yielded no new leads. The hikers tried to resume their lives, but the psychological scars were far more permanent than they could have ever possibly imagined. Sarah reportedly sold her house and moved to a city that was far away from any large forests or remote wilderness areas. Mark began to study the local history of the Cascades in an attempt to find some kind of peace or closure. He reportedly found several old newspaper articles that mentioned a similar incident occurring in the same general area back in 1982. Those records conflict with the official police reports of that time, which stated that the missing hikers had simply lost their way. However, the archived notes from the search team described finding the exact same circle of stones around the abandoned campfire. This detail was never released to the general public, and it remains a secret kept within the locked files of the county. The story of Mark and Sarah is a quiet but terrifying example of the unknown dangers that can lurk in our world. We like to think that we're safe when we enter the woods, but the truth is often much more complex and frightening. They don't have the answers they're looking for, and they likely never will find the truth about that cold July weekend. Sometimes the things that follow us out of the darkness are the things that we can never truly understand or explain away. In this new story, home alone during a snowstorm, then someone knocked. The winter of 2018 brought a historic blizzard to the Catskill Mountains that stranded many residents for several days. 24-year-old Emily Vance was a freelance graphic designer who had rented a remote cabin to finish her work. She reportedly planned to stay for 14 days, but a heavy snowstorm began to bury the house on the third night. According to dispatch logs from the Sullivan County Sheriff, she made a call regarding an unidentified visitor late that same evening. County files from 2018 indicate that the cabin was located miles away from the nearest neighbor in a dense forest. Emily had stocked up on supplies because she didn't want to leave the property until her big project was finally finished. The electricity reportedly failed around 10 o'clock at night as the wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour outside the cabin. She used a small kerosene lamp to light the living room while she listened to the sounds of the heavy wooden structure. A state record mentions that the temperature inside the home dropped to 40 degrees within just a few hours of the outage. Emily was huddled under several blankets when she first heard a soft, rhythmic tapping against the heavy oak front door that night. She initially dismissed the sound as a tree branch because the storm was shaking the entire foundation of the small mountain cabin. However, the knocking became much louder and more deliberate, as if someone was trying to get her attention through the thick wood. Dispatch logs from that evening show that Emily called the local authorities at exactly 11:22 to report a suspicious person. The operator reportedly told her that no patrol cars could reach her location until the snowplows cleared the main access road. Emily grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and moved toward the window to see if anyone was standing on the covered front porch. The glass was completely covered in thick frost, which prevented her from seeing anything beyond the blurry reflection of her own face. The sound of the knocking suddenly moved from the front door to the back of the house near the small kitchen area. Emily reportedly felt a sense of dread because the back door was much thinner and the lock wasn't as secure as before. She stayed in the middle of the room because she didn't want to be near any of the large glass windows or doors. The operator could hear the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the house while Emily was still on the phone. State records described this sound as a blunt impact that was strong enough to shake the kitchen cabinets and rattle the plates. Archived notes from the following investigation state that the knocking continued for nearly 20 minutes without any verbal response from outside. Emily shouted through the door, but she didn't hear any voice over the sound of the wind screaming through the frozen trees. Some locals claimed that a drifter had been seen walking along the highway several miles south of the cabin earlier that day. Investigators never confirmed the identity of this individual or if they had the equipment to survive in such a brutal winter storm. The state records indicate that the footprints found later were far too large to belong to any of the local forest residents. Records conflict regarding whether the front door had been tampered with or if the locks were simply frozen shut from the ice. Morning light revealed a strange scene that the investigators would later document in a detailed county file from 2019 for court. There were no human footprints in the deep snow surrounding the cabin, despite the clear reports of someone circling the entire perimeter. Instead, the search team found deep, circular indentations in the ice that didn't match any known footwear or local wildlife in New York. Some locals claimed that the pressure of the frozen ground can sometimes create unusual patterns during a very rapid change in temperature. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the marks were concentrated specifically around the entry points of the remote mountain home during the storm. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that someone might have used stilts or another device to avoid leaving recognizable human tracks. The investigation turned to the history of the property, which had been built on an old logging site from the 1950s. County files indicate that the land had been the subject of many legal disputes regarding the boundaries of the neighboring state park. A state record from 2012 mentions a similar incident where a previous tenant reported hearing rhythmic knocking during a heavy rainstorm. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built over a natural vent that produced strange acoustic effects when the wind was strong. Investigators never confirmed if the sound of the knocking was a physical person or just a very rare environmental phenomenon of nature. Records conflict about whether the previous tenant had actually seen a figure standing in the woods before they decided to move out. Emily decided to leave the cabin immediately after the roads were cleared because she didn't feel safe staying there any longer alone. She reportedly told the investigators that she felt like someone was watching her from the tree line as she packed her car. Dispatch logs from the following week show that she called once more to report a strange vehicle parked at the gate entrance. When the deputies arrived, they found a set of archived notes sitting on the passenger seat of an abandoned and rusted truck. These notes belonged to a former surveyor who had disappeared in the same region during a similar winter storm in 2011. State records describe the surveyor as a very experienced man who knew the mountain trails better than almost anyone else in the county. The discovery of the abandoned truck led the investigators to believe that the two cases might be connected by a single individual. However, there were no signs of life inside the vehicle, and the engine had been cold for at least several months already. Some locals claimed that they had seen the old truck moving through the woods at night without any of its headlights turned on. Investigators never confirmed these sightings because the mechanical condition of the vehicle made it impossible for it to be driven by anyone. County files from 2019 show that the truck was registered to a man who had passed away over 10 years earlier. This data conflict caused a lot of confusion for the detectives who were trying to find a logical explanation for recent events. Emily moved back to the city, but she reportedly continued to have nightmares about the rhythmic knocking on the heavy oak door. She couldn't forget the way the house shook or the feeling that something was trying to find a way inside the warm cabin. Dispatch logs reveal that several other residents in the Catskill Mountains reported similar sounds during the remainder of the winter of 2018. Every report mentioned the same pattern of knocking, followed by a period of silence and then a heavy blow against the walls. State records never identified a suspect or a group of people who might have been responsible for these strange and terrifying events. The case remains an open file in the county office because the physical evidence doesn't support a clear conclusion for the record. The archived notes from the surveyor's truck contained several maps of the region with specific locations marked with a small red circle. One of these circles was located exactly at the coordinates of the cabin where Emily had been staying during the winter blizzard. State records indicate that the surveyor was investigating reports of strange ground vibrations that were occurring deep within the mountain forest area. He reportedly believed that these vibrations were caused by a hidden geological feature that had never been properly documented by the government. Some locals claimed that the sounds were much more frequent during the winter months when the ground was frozen and the air thin. Investigators never confirmed the existence of any such feature because the terrain was too dangerous to explore with the heavy drilling equipment. County files from 2020 include a summary of the forensic evidence found on the exterior of the mountain cabin after the snow. The siding of the house showed signs of being struck by a flat object with a surface area of approximately 4 inches. These marks were located nearly 7 feet above the ground, which is much higher than a person could reach without a ladder. Dispatch logs from the search team mention that no ladders or large tools were found anywhere on the property during the sweep. Investigators never confirmed if the marks were made by a tool or by a biological entity that possessed a very high reach. The state records focus on the possibility of falling ice chunks from the roof, but the pattern of the marks was consistent. Emily's lawyer reportedly requested a copy of the archived notes to see if there was any mention of a specific person nearby. The county files mention a recluse who lived in a cave system several miles away, but he had a very solid alibi. Records conflict regarding the exact location of this individual during the night of the blizzard when the knocking first began at door. Some locals claimed that the recluse was a peaceful man who didn't have any reason to harass a stranger in the winter. Investigators never confirmed his involvement, and he eventually stopped cooperating with the local sheriff's department after the first few rounds of questioning. The lack of a clear suspect made it impossible for the state to file any formal charges in the case of Emily. A final review of the dispatch logs from 2018 revealed a third call that had been dropped due to poor signal. In this short recording, Emily sounded much more panicked, and she mentioned seeing a shadow moving across the frosted glass of window. She reportedly said that the shadow was too thin to be a person, and it seemed to glide rather than walk on. Investigators never confirmed the presence of such a figure, and they attributed the sighting to the high stress of the dangerous situation. State records indicate that the cabin was sold later that year to a developer who planned to tear it down and build. The new owner reportedly found a collection of small stones arranged in a circle on the porch after the first light snow. These stones were perfectly smooth, and they didn't match any of the rocks found in the immediate vicinity of the property. County files from 2021 state that the new owner decided to abandon the project and sell the land back. He didn't provide a specific reason for his decision, but he mentioned that the atmosphere of the forest felt very unwelcoming. Some locals claimed that the mountain has a memory of the things that have happened there over the many long years. Investigators never confirmed these claims because they don't deal with the legends or the local folklore of the rural mountain regions. The archived notes from the original case are now kept in a secure storage facility in the city of Albany for reference. Emily now lives in a high-rise apartment building in a different state, where she feels much safer behind layers of security. She still checks the locks on her doors every single night before she goes to bed because she can't forget sound. Dispatch logs from her new neighborhood show that she has never called the police since she moved away from the Catskills. However, she reportedly keeps a small lamp burning in the hallway to remind her that she is no longer alone in dark. State records from New York show that the cabin was eventually reclaimed by the forest as the roof collapsed under snow. No one has lived on that specific piece of land since the events of 2018 when the knocking began during storm. The state records from 2022 describe a discovery made by a team of scientists who were studying the soil. They found a series of metallic fragments buried near the foundation of the old cabin that were composed of a rare, archived notes from the laboratory state that the fragments showed signs of extreme heat exposure despite being buried in the ground. Investigators never confirmed where the metal came from or if it had any connection to the sounds Emily heard during blizzard. Records conflict about whether the fragments were part of an old industrial machine or if they belonged to something much more. Some locals claimed that the area had been used for clandestine military testing during the 1970s, but this was never verified. County files indicate that the metallic fragments were located exactly beneath the spot where the heavy knocking had been reported by tenant. The soil in that specific area was reportedly devoid of any life, including the typical insects and fungi found in forest. Dispatch logs from the environmental team record a sense of unease as they worked near the ruins of the collapsed cabin. One of the scientists reportedly mentioned that his electronic sensors were malfunctioning whenever he approached the center of the old building. This data conflict led to a temporary halt in the research project until the equipment could be properly shielded from interference. Investigators never confirmed the source of the magnetic field that was causing the sensors to display such erratic and unpredictable data. The archived notes from the surveyor who disappeared in 2011 were re-examined by a specialist in the state police. These notes contained a drawing of a strange structure that he had found hidden deep within a narrow crevice in rocks. The drawing depicted a series of metallic poles that were arranged in a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the indentations. Some locals claimed that they had seen similar poles while hiking in the more remote sections of the mountain forest years. Investigators never confirmed the existence of this structure because the surveyor had not provided the exact coordinates in his personal. State records from 2023 show that the case remains officially unsolved despite the new evidence found by research team. The mystery of the knocking during the snowstorm of 2018 continues to haunt the people who live in Catskills. Dispatch logs are still analyzed by amateur investigators who believe they can find the one detail that the police managed to overlook. Every winter, when the snow begins to fall and the wind starts to howl, residents are reminded of the story. They reportedly make sure to check their locks and stay away from the windows when they hear a tapping sound. County files from 2024 list the area as a restricted zone due to the potential dangers of terrain. Investigators never confirmed if the danger was purely physical or if there was something else that the state wanted hidden. In this news story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of. He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirm that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife Alara and their young daughter Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like a... He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time.